Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America. If you are returning, welcome back, and if you're new here, welcome aboard. This show breaks down each of the 250 years of American history across 250 episodes telling a linear story of our country. Tomorrow marks our 25th episode, and you're not going to hear me popping in at the start of the episode to do this introduction, as I think by this point the show kind of speaks for itself. But without further ado, let's get into the episode. We're going a little light with the start of the year, as one custom of this show has been to provide a brief biography of signers of the Declaration upon their passing, and a feature we'll be adding beginning with today's episode is to memorialize presidents in much the same fashion. America's first president, George Washington, passes away this year, so we'll spend quite a bit of time recounting his life, and while we've recounted much of his public and political life since 1776, there is additional information we'll provide about his early life and his private actions here that shed more light on the man who helped make this nation what it is. This may be the longest episode yet, as today's other main story is that of the Freeze Rebellion. Welcome to 1799 in America. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and the House of Delegates of Virginia passes a resolution requesting that their senators and representatives in Congress propose amendments to the federal Constitution. The proposed amendment reads that in addition to the other qualifications prescribed by said Constitution, no person shall be eligible as a senator or representative in the Congress of the United States except a natural-born citizen, or unless he shall have been a resident in the United States at the time of the Declaration of Independence, or naturalized and admitted a citizen at the time of making this amendment to the Constitution. No person shall be eligible as Vice President of the United States except a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of the federal Constitution, and that no person shall be eligible to that office who shall not have attained to the age of 35 years and been 14 years a resident within the United States. It's the coldest January in years, and the young republic and the mood remains tense. Now in his third year as president, John Adams is balancing a nation on the cusp of war. Naval conflict in the Caribbean and Atlantic sees the U.S. Navy and American privateers seizing French vessels, while American commerce continues, though under constant threat. On January 25th, Eliakim Spooner secures a patent for the first seeding machine, which is listed as a machine for planting corn, beans, etc., though, like so many patents from the time, records are lost as to how this device functioned or even what it looked like. On January 30th, Congress responds to the diplomatic attempts of George Logan, a private citizen who sailed to Paris hoping to broker peace without governmental approval. Logan had recommended various actions that France might take to improve relations, and it's unclear and often debated whether Logan's mission had any influence, though the French government does take some actions he suggested. By passing what is now called the Logan Act, Congress makes unauthorized diplomacy a federal offense. Anyone found to be in violation of the law must meet 3 requirements. They must communicate with a foreign government, do so without authority of the United States, and must do so for the purpose of influencing the actions of the foreign government in relation to a dispute with the United States or of defeating U.S. policy. The government was actually made aware of Logan's plan to head to France before he went, but as is acknowledged in a letter to George Washington last summer, No laws were already on the books that could have given the government the power to stop him, and Logan is never charged with a criminal offense. It is an interesting role that the aging George Washington plays at the moment. Despite the perception that the second term as president ended his public life, he remains politically active through correspondence from Mount Vernon as he supports Federalist candidates and policies in a much more overt way than he ever did as president, in part due to his disappointment with Jeffersonian Republicans. On February 9th, Captain Thomas Truxtun, commanding the USS Constellation, captures a French frigate in the West Indies, securing the first major victory for the new U.S. Navy during the quasi-war with France. Also in February, the first printed ballots in the United States are authorized for use in Pennsylvania. The marked ballots will slide into a heavy paper pocket, which is just the right size for placement in a vest pocket, giving rise to the nickname vest pocket tickets. On the 25th, the United States Congress passes federal quarantine legislation looking to slow the spread of illness in large cities. Though similar legislation has existed in American colonies since the mid-1600s, and we've covered the first federal law of the sort in 96, this 8-section act lays out a more comprehensive plan for the government response to pandemics. It authorizes federal officials to aid in the execution of state quarantine and health laws and provides a mechanism for evacuation of federal employees from the scene of an epidemic. In the case of prevalence of any contagious or epidemic disease, the Secretary of Treasury is empowered to order the removal of revenue officers, with the courts authorized to relocate and provide for the removal of prisoners. In the event that an epidemic strikes the seat of government, the president is given the discretion to direct the removal of public offices. On March 2nd, Congress acts on an object of perpetual concern during Washington's presidency, that of standardizing weights and measures for trade. The law, as passed, states that each surveyor at U.S. ports must from time to time examine and try the weights, measures, and other instruments used in ascertaining the duties on imports, though the legislation is not effectively put into operation for decades. Throughout February, John Fries has been leading what's to become known as Freeze Rebellion in response to the property taxes being levied on lands and slaves. Meetings, petitions, and some armed resistance takes place demanding repeal of what these Pennsylvanians view as Federalist overreach, and they resist federal assessors entering private homes. These assessors are to measure the houses and count windows to determine the value on a progressive scale, and homeowners are now expected to pay between 0.8 and 1.1% of their property's value in taxes annually. Thus far, the entirety of American history has something to do with rebelling against taxes. But what makes this rebellion different is that the stated plan is to remain nonviolent as the men look to expand the role of local people within the political system rather than attacking it from without. Things do, though, occasionally get physical, and already assessors are being threatened or blocked in multiple townships, and in Northampton, county tax officials are chased off of properties. With enforcement being frustrated, on March 3rd, a United States Marshal named William Nichols begins arresting tax resistors in Northampton County, operating under instructions from Secretary of State Timothy Pickering. Over the next 2 days, Nichols arrests several men and imprisons them in Bethlehem. One of those detained is Frederick Heaney, a vocal resistor. And on the 6th, John Fries, a former militia captain and auctioneer of Milford Township, organizes a group of armed men to free the prisoners, riding through the countryside to rally support. On the 7th of March, between 50 and 100 armed men march into Bethlehem and surround the Sun Inn, where the prisoners are being held by Marshal Nichols. Fries demands the release of the prisoners, and Nichols, fearing violence, releases the men without a fight. The rebels disperse peacefully and return home feeling the unjust imprisonment of their neighbors has been corrected, but news of the release spreads all the way to the top. When President John Adams is informed of the uprising on the 12th, he and his cabinet, particularly Pickering and Wilcott, see the act as an armed insurrection against federal law, and in the latter half of March, Secretary of War James McHenry orders troops to suppress the rebellion, and a force of 120 dragoons and light infantry under General William McPherson is mobilized to Northampton County. In a quick detour, on March 29th, New York takes a bold step, joining other northern states passing a law for the gradual abolition of slavery. The law frees children born to enslaved mothers after July 4th of 79, guaranteeing full emancipation at adulthood, males at the age of 28 and females at the age of 25. Heading back to Northampton County, by the 5th of April, 120 federal troops arrive, setting up their headquarters in Bethlehem. Immediately upon their arrival, dozens of suspected rebels are arrested, including men who only protested non-violently, but there's little pushback against this enforcement action. The arrested men are soon going to stand trial, but the court of public opinion rules first. On April 7th, John Fries is captured near Trembowersville after being turned in by an acquaintance. He is taken to Philadelphia to stand trial for treason. Elsewhere, in the nation's future capital city, construction is now well underway, with the White House and north wing of the Capitol now nearing readiness after continuing issues with sourcing material. It will be decades before the Capitol resembles anything we know today, and while Washington personally laid the cornerstone for the Capitol, as we covered in 93, much of the labor has since been completed by freed black men, European laborers, and slaves over the last 5 years. Throughout May and June, grand juries have indicted more than 30 men involved in Free's rebellion for resisting the tax, and most are charged with lesser crimes like obstruction and rioting, but Fries and 2 others are indicted for high treason. Fries is convicted of treason for leading an armed group of men to interfere with federal law enforcement, and on the 9th is sentenced to death by hanging, with the 2 other men soon to follow. August brings the yellow fever to Philadelphia once again, and as cases surge, federal authorities make a drastic decision. On August 26th, Congress votes to evacuate Philadelphia, heading to Trenton, while the fever continues to spread and the administrative departments of State and War also begin moving offices. President Adams, though initially resistant, relents and also arrives in Trenton around mid-October. Federal courts, the Navy, and the legislature suspend operations, and for months, the sole capital for the nation is a cramped legislature in Trenton, but no one dares return to Philadelphia as the disease claims hundreds. On October 13th, William Paca passes away at the age of 58. He was born on October 31st of 1740 at his family's home north of Baltimore, but there's very little documentation about Paca's boyhood. What we do know is that he graduated from the College of Philadelphia in 59, then headed to Annapolis, Maryland, ready to embark on his career in law. Paca helped found a debating society called the Forensic Club. It is here that he also forged his friendship with Samuel Chase, who would also sign the Declaration of Independence. In 1765, Paca and Samuel Chase founded their county's Sons of Liberty and mobilized support against the Stamp Act. Paca's public popularity as a result of his involvement led him to be elected to the city's Common Council in 66. The next year, he was elected as a delegate to the lower house. In 73, an act expired that regulated tobacco and fees for certain officers. Paca joined other Maryland patriots in urging the governor to not continue the act, But when the governor could not be dissuaded, Peka, with his friend Samuel, staged a melodramatic protest. They formed a procession leading to gallows where they hanged the governor's proclamation. Afterwards, they enclosed the proclamation in a coffin, dug a grave, and buried it. The oppressive Tea Act and the erosion of trust between England and the colonies led Peka to organize committees and actively oppose the Boston Port Act. In September of 74, Peka joined the First Continental Congress when it met in Philadelphia, and went on to vote for independence on July 2nd of 76, signing the Declaration on August 2nd. In 1780, Congress appointed him judge of a newly created Court of Appeals. In recognition of his wartime services and support for the military, Peka was made a member of the Society of the Cincinnati and became vice president of the Maryland chapter from 84 until 87. Peka was a leader of the anti-federalist movement in Maryland, but despite this, he voted in 88 to approve the Constitution. President George Washington appointed him judge for the Court of Maryland in 89, and he held this post until his death, today on October 13th, a few weeks shy of his 59th birthday. Meanwhile, back in Trenton, Adams writes to Congress about continuing naval seizures, but with a focus towards peace, not escalation. French overtures for renewed talks have quietly resumed even before Napoleon's rise, and Adams prepares to send envoys. By November, public health improves enough for evacuees to return to Philadelphia, and the government moves its operations back to the city. On November 12th, Andrew Ellicott, an early American astronomer, is on a ship off the Florida Keys and writes in his journal that the whole heaven appeared as if illuminated with sky rockets, flying in an infinity of directions, and I was in constant expectation of some of them falling on the vessel. They continued until put out by the light of the sun after daybreak. While it is not referred to such at the time, Ellicott has just witnessed the Leonids meteor shower, and this journal entry is the first known record of a meteor shower in North America. It's been just shy of 23 years since George Washington was out on a cold night crossing the Delaware with the Continental Army, and tonight, on December 12th, Washington is riding through sleet at Mount Vernon and neglects to change from his wet clothes. The next day, a sore throat and fever sets in. Physicians are called and they bleed him on the 14th. Within hours, his breathing fails. Washington is gone. 10 p.m., the 14th of December, 1799, George Washington dies surrounded by his wife Martha, his valet, housemaids, and some friends. His last words reportedly being, "'Tis well." Bells toll in cities, Congress suspends sessions, and the news shatters the country. America's response is one of profound grief and national mourning. On December 18th, a solemn funeral is held at Mount Vernon. Congress declares a month of national mourning. In Boston, Charleston, New York, and Philadelphia, mock funerals are staged, mourners wear black sashes and badges, and a grateful republic weeps. Washington's passing sends the nation back to its foundational anxieties. Questions such as, will this republic survive without its first hero? Will its system of limited power and civic virtue hold up to the tests to come? On December 26th, George Washington is eulogized by Colonel Henry Lee as first in war, first in peace, and first in hearts of his countrymen. It's debatable, but with his death, the founding era is largely considered to be at its close. The nation, still raw and fragile, must now look forward to a new century, new challenges, and the next generation of leaders. Now, I've thought long and hard about the best way to present a reflection of Washington's life, and as it is always my goal to present nothing but the best and most accurate information, I want to ensure the information I present is unbiased and comes exclusively from primary sources. But I'm no biographer, and to present an engaging and narrative biography, I'll most likely be retreading ground that's been pretty well covered. I've looked into reading from modern biographies, but some modern accounts, while accurate in their facts, also include criticisms of the man from a modern lens and tend to focus on controversies. And in the memorial reflections we include in this show, they're generally meant to be a kind reflection of the true patriot's contributions to our country. After much searching, I eventually decided to include the biography that you are about to hear. The following comes from a well-researched biography, written to be approachable to all ages, and was originally published in 1917. It omits much of the elements of Washington's life that may be considered controversial from a modern standpoint, and some may say it borders on hero worship, but I still feel it is the most fitting account in terms of this show's tone. I always want to be factual, and I don't myself like to shy away from controversy or gloss over the flaws of the people we mention, but in memorial of George Washington, here is the first 3 chapters of Callista McCabe Courtney's book, George Washington, in which Washington's early life is covered up to 1776, and then an excerpt of the final chapter in which the memorial of Washington is recounted.
The 22nd day of February is a national holiday in America because, as everyone knows, it is the anniversary of George Washington's birthday. All loyal Americans love and honor him, the greatest man in the history of the Republic. He was born in 1732 in Westmoreland County, Virginia, where the Potomac River flowed past his father's farm. The farmhouse, called Wakefield, was burned, but the United States government built a monument to mark the place where it stood. When Wakefield was destroyed, the family lived for a time in a home, later called Mount Vernon, in Fairfax County. But the real boyhood home of George Washington was a farm overlooking the Rappahannock River, where his parents went when he was about 8 years old. His father, Augustine Washington, was a prosperous Virginia planter, and owned several fine estates. His mother's name was Mary Ball. She was a beautiful and sensible woman, and a wise, firm, and loving mother. She was his father's second wife, and there were 2 little lads already in the home, Lawrence and Augustine, when she came to take the place of their mother who had died. Besides these 2 half-brothers, George had 2 sisters and 3 brothers. The 2 older sons were sent to England to school. When George was 8 years old, Lawrence returned home, having finished his studies. A great affection at once sprang up between them. George was a fine, manly little fellow whom any big brother could love, and he looked up to Lawrence as a model. Before long, Lawrence went away to the wars, serving under Admiral Vernon in the West Indies. His letters filled George with admiration, and he at once became commander-in-chief of all the boys at school. They had parades and battles in imitation of those Lawrence wrote about. George's father died when he was 12 years old, but fortunately he had a wise and careful mother. She taught him respect and obedience to authority, justice and courtesy to others, loyalty to God and his country. He had a high temper and a spirit of command which she taught him to control. A few times only in his life, when greatly provoked, did his anger get beyond bounds. He loved and honored his mother deeply and never forgot her teachings. George and his younger brothers were educated in the country schools of Virginia. George soon showed that he had a practical mind, caring little for poetry and literature. He liked mathematics and wanted to know about business and keeping accounts. He spent hours copying into a book the exact forms of legal papers of all kinds. He was very neat and accurate in his schoolwork, and learned the value of system and order. He never began a thing without finishing it. He never did anything without knowing the reason why. When he grew up, these fine principles and this skill and accuracy fitted him to take a great part in the history of America. All boys in those early days knew how to handle guns and manage horses. George was an expert rider, and loved the life of the woods. Being exceptionally tall and strong, he was the champion athlete at school. It is said he could throw a stone farther than any man in Virginia. Besides, he was so fair-minded that the boys always let him settle their disputes and quarrels, knowing he would give every one a square deal. He was the admired and trusted leader of them all. In addition to his mother's care, George soon had the loving advice and devoted friendship of his brother Lawrence. The war was over, and that splendid young gentleman had come home, and had married the charming Anne Fairfax. His house, willed to him by his father, stood upon a hill overlooking the beautiful Potomac River. To this lovely home, surrounded by lawns and stately trees, Lawrence gave the name Mount Vernon, in honor of the admiral under whom he had served. George spent as much time as possible here, where he met many persons of education and refinement. While he was still a young boy, he wrote out for himself a long list of rules of politeness and good behavior. He had observed that older people do not like careless children, who forget the comforts and rights of others. As a result, he was well liked by his brother's friends. Among them were often military and naval officers, who told him stories of war and adventure in foreign lands. When he was 14, one of these officers would have appointed him midshipman in the British Navy. He was eager to go, but his mother needed his help in the management of their property, so he continued 2 years more at school, studying mathematics, engineering, and surveying. The country was then new and wild, and there was much work for land surveyors, whose business it was to measure off boundaries and describe the positions of rivers, mountains, and forests in a piece of land. George learned to do this so well that by the time he was 16 he was appointed public surveyor of his county. His chief work for the next 3 years was on the vast tracts of land owned by Lord Fairfax, the uncle of Lawrence Washington's wife. Though very young, George was a great favorite with his lordship, who often took him fox hunting. George was a bold and skillful horseman, and rode well after the hounds. The estate of Lord Fairfax, lying between the Potomac and the Rappahannock rivers, and extending to the Alleghany Mountains, had been given to his grandfather by King Charles II. These lands had never been settled nor surveyed. People known as squatters were now moving in and taking possession of the best places without permission. It became necessary to have the land surveyed, and these settlers either driven out or made to pay for certain definite parts. Lord Fairfax knew no one who could do this so well as George Washington, for he was strong and fair enough to deal wisely with the rough settlers. It was just what George wanted to do, and he gladly accepted the offer. In March, George set out for his first trip into the wilderness. He was just 16 years old, and it was his first big undertaking. George Fairfax, Anne's brother, went with him. They crossed the mountains into the lovely valley of the Shenandoah River. George's letters home were full of the beauty of the country and the richness of the land. After the first night they found it more comfortable to sleep out under the sky than in the poor untidy lodgings of the settlers. They lived on wild turkey and other game. They did their own cooking, roasting the meat on sticks over the fire and eating it on broad, clean chips. They met a party of war-painted Indians, and for the first time George saw an Indian war dance. He studied the Indians carefully, for he wanted to understand their ways so that he might know how to deal with them. All through his life he was kind and just in his treatment of these people. The work of surveying tracts of land took them long distances, among the mountains and through the valleys. They traveled on horseback over the woodland trails, for there were as yet no roads. Sometimes they found the rivers so high that they crossed in canoes, their horses swimming. George returned in a month, well pleased with his adventures, and Lord Fairfax, delighted with his success, paid him well. The cordial, friendly, free life of Virginia pleased Lord Fairfax more than did the life in England. When he heard the account of the fertility and beauty of the Shenandoah Valley, he decided to make his home there. George laid out for him a fine farm of 10,000 acres. The long stone farmhouse, surrounded by servants' quarters, stables, and kennels, was located on a charming hillside. The place was called Greenway Court, and visitors always found a warm welcome, whether Indians, woodsmen, or friends from the cities. Here George stayed when on his surveying trips and during the hunting seasons. Until he was 19, George spent his time at his work, or at home with his mother, or at Mount Vernon with Lawrence. The society of his home and friends kept him from being spoiled by the roughness of the wilderness. He was now 6 feet 2 inches in height, with a fresh outdoor complexion, blue eyes, and brown hair. He had attractive manners. He was careful about his dress, and presented a pleasing appearance. Through all his life, George Washington was a true gentleman. He was so well paid for his work that he was able to buy several pieces of fine land. His noble character gave him a high place among the leading men of his colony. When he was 19, he was appointed one of 4 military officers in the colonies, with the rank and pay of a major, $750 a year, a considerable sum at that time. Troubles had now arisen between the French and the English about the ownership of lands west of the Alleghany Mountains. The Indians, regarding the lands as theirs, took part in the disturbance. To protect her frontiers, Virginia was divided into 4 districts, each under a leader, whose duty it was to organize and drill militia. George at once began to study military tactics, and the arts of war. This was interrupted by a trip to the West Indies with his beloved brother Lawrence, who was ill of consumption. They had hardly arrived there when George had a severe attack of smallpox. Though he soon got well, his face was scarred for life. He wrote home about the beauty of the island, the wonderful trees and fruits, and his social pleasures, dinners, parties, and drives. For the first time in his life he attended a theatre. He visited the courts of justice and the fortifications, studied the laws, the soil, and the crops, learning all that could be learned about the island. The trip resulted in no lasting good for Lawrence, however, for he died the following summer, beloved and honored by the colonists. George was only 20, but Lawrence left Mount Vernon in his charge, and the care of his wife and little daughter. The farm on the Rappahannock had been given to George by their father. These 2 fine estates, with the property he had bought for himself, made George a large land owner when still a very young man. The care of all this property and his military duties kept him busy. During this time, the trouble with the French had grown more serious. The English, having settled the eastern sea-coast, claimed the lands to the west for their settlers. The French claimed the same lands by reason of having explored them first. The rich country lying west of the Alleghany Mountains, between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River, was the region in question. The French were planning to hold it by a line of forts from the lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and near the eastern end of Lake Erie they had built 2 forts. Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia decided to send a message to the French commandant, St. Pierre, warning him to keep off English soil. He needed someone brave and strong enough to travel in the winter, through hundreds and hundreds of miles of forests and across mountains and swift rivers, who knew how to take care of himself in the woods, who could get along with the Indians, and meet the French officers with courtesy and wisdom. Of all the men in Virginia, the governor chose George Washington, only 21 years old, for this dangerous and important journey. So, late in the autumn of 1753, Major Washington set out for the Ohio River, accompanied by Christopher Gist, a brave and daring frontiersman, and an Indian chief called Half King, as guides, together with interpreters and a small company of trusted men. They traveled on horseback, and took with them tents and supplies for the journey. As they proceeded, cold weather overtook them, and the forests became almost impassable from snow. Traveling was so difficult that when they reached the Monongahela River, they sent 2 men down the river in a canoe with their baggage. These men waited for them at the fork where the Alleghany River joins the Monongahela to form the Ohio. As soon as Washington saw this fork, he marked it as a splendid location for a fort, of which we shall learn more later. Pushing on a little farther, Washington and his men reached a little settlement on the Ohio River, where Indian chiefs met him in council. He told them he had a letter for the French commandant, and asked for their advice and help. Indians are very dignified, and slow in their councils. They kept Washington waiting for several days. Then 3 of the greatest chiefs went with him to the French forts. These were in what is now northwestern Pennsylvania. It was a journey of many miles, through snow and mud, and took nearly a week. It was almost the middle of December before Washington delivered his message to the French commandant, St. Pierre. He was politely received by the French officers, with whom he discussed matters very tactfully. It took some days to prepare the reply to the governor of Virginia. While they waited, the French tried, with presents and liquor, to coax Washington's Indian friends to leave him. At this time the Indian tribes were in a difficult position. Both the French and the English were trying to get their lands, and each seeking to win their alliance against the other. Washington reminded the chiefs that he had their word of honor, and so kept them with him. After receiving the French reply, the party started back home, going as far as possible in canoes. The rivers were swollen and full of ice, making the water trip extremely dangerous. On Christmas Day, Washington began his long journey home, nearly 1,000 miles through almost trackless forests. The horses became so tired that he and Christopher Gist decided to hurry on foot, in advance of the others, to the fork of the Ohio, leaving their horses to be brought later. They tramped several days, camping in the forests at night. An Indian met them and offered to show them a short cut, but he was treacherous and guided them out of their way and tried to shoot them. They escaped, traveling as fast as they could all night and all the next day. At nightfall, they came to the Allegheny River, expecting to find it frozen over, but it was full of floating ice, and they had no way to cross. After working a whole day with only a small hatchet, they made a raft. In trying to pole this across the swift current, Washington was thrown into the water and was nearly drowned, but he managed to get on the raft again, and they reached an island, where they spent the night. It was so intensely cold that Gist's hands and feet were frozen. The next morning they got ashore on the chunks of ice, and by supper time were in the warm house of a trader named Frazier. In a few days they were rested enough to go on to Gist's home, where the Major bade his companion good-bye, and went on alone on horseback, through constant snows and bitter cold. On the 16th of January, 1754, Major Washington delivered the French reply to Governor Dinwiddie. He had been absent almost 3 months on his perilous journey, and you can imagine that his mother and friends were glad to see him safe at home again. The governor and the colonists were very proud of the way Washington had performed his errand. His wisdom in his dealings with the Indians and the French, his firmness, his courage and daring in the face of peril, had indeed been marked. He had not only done well what he had been sent to do, but he had thoroughly examined the French forts and made notes of the best places for English defenses. From that time he was trusted with important duties. As might have been expected, the reply from the French commandant stated that the land belonged to French settlers, and that they intended to keep it. It was Washington's opinion that the French intended in the spring to take possession of the whole country. The governor of Virginia tried to interest other colonies to help fight the French. When they refused, Virginia sent Captain Trent to raise a company of men in the western country, and to build a fort at the fork of the Ohio River, where the city of Pittsburgh now stands. Washington, now colonel, was ordered to raise 300 men and build a road to this fort for cannon and supplies. He succeeded in getting together 150 men, who were poorly equipped and without training. They built the road as far as Cumberland. Here, in April, 1754, they met Captain Trent's men in retreat. A French force of 300 men had surprised them by suddenly paddling down the river in canoes, and planting their guns before the fort, with a summons to surrender in an hour. One young officer and 15 men could not hold out against so many, so they surrendered and marched back over the mountains. Every day traders and settlers came by, hurrying eastward. They said the French had taken the place at the fork of the Ohio and were building a strong fort. They were coaxing the Indians with fine presents to fight the English. If the British were to succeed against the French, they required a good road over which to march an army. So Colonel Washington hurried the road building as much as possible, but at best he could make only slow progress in such mountainous country. He received a message from the friendly chief Half King, telling him that a French force was on its way to attack him. With a little band of men, Washington made his way at night through the forest, in a heavy rain, to the camp of Half King. Indian scouts tracked the Frenchmen to a forest near a place called Great Meadows, where in May Washington and his men attacked them on one side and Indians on the other. The colonel was in the thickest of the fight, and, for the first time, heard bullets whistling about his head. 10 Frenchmen were killed, and 21 taken prisoners. Half King sent the scalps of the dead men, with tomahawks and strings of black wampum, small beads made of shells and sometimes used by the Indians as money, to all his allies, and asked them to join the English. This was Washington's first skirmish, and it opened the French and Indian War that lasted 7 years. Washington now encamped at Great Meadows, where he dug rude trenches, which he called Fort Necessity. Supplies of food and ammunition were slow in reaching him. He had been reinforced with troops from the command of Colonel Fry, who had died on the way, and Washington was now made commander of the joint forces of about 300 men. The French finished their fort, which they called Duquesne. Then about 900 French and Indians attacked Washington. The English fought bravely, but Half King and his men deserted Washington. Being greatly outnumbered, he was obliged to surrender. Colonel Washington led his beaten and discouraged men home, trying to cheer them while sharing their hardships. The campaign, fought against such odds, had not been successful, but Washington was publicly thanked for his bravery and hard work. He resigned his commission and went to look after his mother's affairs. He soon settled at Mount Vernon and began to work on his farm. His greatest desire was to devote himself to country life, but he was needed too much by the colony to be allowed to live as a private man. Early in the following year, 1775, England sent out General Braddock and 1,000 soldiers trained in battle to take Fort Duquesne and drive the French from the Ohio Valley. Washington was appointed a member of his staff. General Braddock was a brave and experienced soldier, but he knew nothing of warfare in a new country, amid great forests and savage foes. He knew but one way to fight, which he had learned in the orderly camps and wide fields of Europe, and felt that nobody could defeat his well-drilled soldiers. He thought Washington too young to give advice, and paid no attention to what he said. He looked with contempt upon the queerly dressed, untrained Virginia troops, whom he called raw recruits. Instead of being friendly and generous with the Indians, Braddock treated them coldly, and they left him. With much difficulty, the army and its supplies were brought over the mountains and approached Fort Duquesne early in July. As they drew near it, Braddock's men put on their scarlet uniforms and forded the river, with bands playing and colors flying. It was the first time Washington ever saw a regular, well-disciplined army, and he enjoyed the sight, although he wondered how their orderly ranks were going to fight among the rocks and trees. Fearing an attack from the woods, he wanted to send Indian scouts and Virginia Rangers ahead. General Braddock admired Washington, but could not help laughing at his fears. So he sent his soldiers gaily forward. Suddenly they were attacked in front. With hideous yells the Indians fell upon their flanks. All that General Braddock had learned of warfare was of little use to him now in the wilderness, but he was courageous and determined. 4 horses were shot under him, and he was fatally wounded. Before he died, he praised the Virginians like a brave and true gentleman, and apologized to Washington for not heeding his advice. He left to him his horse and his servant. All the staff officers were killed but Washington. His splendid height and broad shoulders made him a fine target as he rode about the field trying to rally the men. His horses were killed under him, and his clothing was torn by bullets. An Indian chief said, "A power mightier than we shielded him. He cannot die in battle." The contest ended in a terrible defeat for the English. The regulars were useless and frightened. The despised Virginians were brave, but too few in number to meet the enemy alone. The survivors retreated with the wounded to Fort Cumberland, Maryland. Washington had been twice defeated, but his courage and wisdom were so great that Virginia had made him commander-in-chief of her forces. His tasks were heavy for so young a man. He was only 23 at that time. He did the best he could under many difficulties, and raised and drilled a force of militia. While facing a common danger, the colonies were not united then in any way except under a governor-general sent out from England by the King. Washington had no authority over troops from any other colony, nor would officers commissioned by the King take orders from him. Naturally, all sorts of disputes arose, and finally Washington decided to go to Boston to put all these questions before Governor-General William Shirley. 2 other young Virginia officers rode with him. It was midwinter. They had hundreds of miles of mud roads to travel. They had fine horses, and were attended by mounted black servants in livery. The story of Washington's bravery in Braddock's defeat was known throughout the country. When these 3 handsome young officers reached the cities along the way, they were splendidly entertained, for everyone wanted to honor Washington. He wore fine clothes, and his appearance and manners delighted all who met him. General Shirley received him with favor and granted his requests. Word was brought that the French and Indians were attacking the settlers beyond the mountains. Washington hurried back to his command at Winchester. He was anxious to have the forces and supplies necessary to attack Fort Duquesne at once. But while the people were clamoring for protection, Washington was unable to help them on account of the unfair treatment of Governor Dinwiddie and the indifference of England. His force was too small and untrained to make an attempt against the French. But he remained patient and cheerful, and for almost 2 years he stood by the people who depended upon him. Then William Pitt became Prime Minister of England, 1757, and at once took an interest in the defense of the colonies. Washington was ordered to proceed against Fort Duquesne. That French garrison had been weakened by taking men and supplies to the battlefront on the north, where they were being defeated by the British. Before Washington reached the fort, the commandant set fire to it and fled. Washington planted the British flag upon the still smoking ruins, and on the same site built Fort Pitt, which he named in honor of the great English statesman. This is where the city of Pittsburgh now stands. Thus ended the French occupation of the Ohio Valley. The many cares and hardships Washington had suffered had made him ill, and he returned to Mount Vernon, hoping that his military life was over. He was greatly loved and honored by his soldiers and his fellow countrymen. When Washington was 27 years old, he married a charming young widow, Mrs. Martha Custis. The wedding took place January 6, 1759. Mrs. Custis had a little girl, Martha, 4 years old, and a little boy, John, who was 6. Washington dearly loved these children, whom he taught and trained with great care. He and his wife were great favorites socially, and at their home, Mount Vernon, they entertained many guests. Here the Custis children met many of the prominent men of those days. One of these visitors was Louis Philippe, the exiled king of France. Noticing how many letters Washington wrote, he asked him if he were not afraid of writing something he might regret. Washington answered that he was careful never to do or say a thing he could afterward be sorry for. Washington kept fine horses and dogs and was very fond of hunting. Although busy with the care of his great farms and his wife's large estate, he found time to follow the hounds. His wisdom and honesty were so trusted that aside from his own affairs, other people gave him charge of theirs. He was often called upon to settle disputes, thus preventing lawsuits. He was a member of the Virginia legislature, then called the House of Burgesses, of which he attended every meeting and was careful to know all about the affairs of the colony. When he first took his seat in the legislature, he was thanked for his military service to the colony. He rose to reply, but could only blush and stammer. The speaker said, "Sit down, Mr. Washington. Your modesty equals your valor." For 15 years Washington led a peaceful and happy life with his family. He was kept busy looking after his vast estates. But then again the country began to claim his attention. George III was King of England. Under his rule, unjust laws were made for the colonies, which the wise men of America knew would destroy their rights. The colonies were not represented in the British Parliament where the laws were made, and so claimed that Parliament had no right to tax them. Needing money, England laid heavy taxes on the colonies, which they would not pay. After much trouble, all the taxes were taken off except the one on tea. That was left to prove England's right to tax the colonies. In the autumn of 1773, several ships were sent over loaded with tea, which was to be sold very cheaply. But the colonists refused to have tea at any price rather than submit to taxation without representation. There can be no freedom in a land whose people may be taxed without their consent. From several ports, the ships were sent back. In Boston, a party of citizens dressed as Indians boarded the ships at night, December 16th, and threw all the tea into the harbor. This is called the Boston Tea Party. The same violence occurred at Annapolis, Maryland. To punish the city of Boston, Parliament passed a law that no ship should come in or go out of her harbor. The port was closed and business stopped. News of this was carried to the other colonies. In Virginia, a day of fasting and prayer was appointed. The people did not want to give up their liberties, for which many had come to America. It seemed, on the other hand, very dreadful to go to war with the mother country. The colonies were independent of one another, but knew they must stand together against the injustice of England. Meetings were held in each colony to talk matters over, and it was decided to hold a general congress, made up of men selected by each colony. In the Virginia Convention, Washington was one of the first to say that the colonies ought to be allowed to govern themselves, make their own laws, and decide their own taxes. He was usually very quiet in all that he said and did, but the wrongs of Boston had so stirred him that he made a fiery speech. He said he would raise 1,000 men, pay them himself, and march at their head to the relief of Boston. He said he had hoped that there would be no break with England, and he shrank from the horror of war, but now he began to feel that it could not be avoided, and if so, no sacrifice was too great to preserve the liberties of America for the millions who would some day call it their home. He was one of several delegates chosen to represent Virginia in the General Congress, which was held at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, September 5, 1774. There were 52 members, the ablest men of all the colonies. Someone asked Patrick Henry who was the greatest man among them, and he said, "Colonel Washington, if you speak of solid information and sound judgment." These men met, not as members of separate colonies, but as Americans with one country and one cause. Each meeting was opened with a prayer. Not often, in the whole history of the world, have men had to decide more important and difficult questions. For almost 2 months they discussed all the points in which they believed they were wronged by England. They were careful and just in all that they said. They wanted to keep peace. None of them wished to be independent of England. Neither were they willing to submit to injustice and the loss of their rights and privileges. They wrote a petition to the King and letters to the people of England and of Canada. These papers were very fair and wise and showed the noble minds and loyal hearts of those early great Americans. They were not rebelling, they were simply declaring their rights. In reply, England only passed more unjust laws. The spirit of revolt spread through the colonies. Militia was organized. Some were called "Minute Men" because they promised to leave everything and go to war at a minute's notice. Months passed in active preparations. Military stores were collected. The patriots were determined to face death, rather than submit longer to British oppression. Meanwhile, the British General Gage, stationed in Boston with 4,000 British soldiers, decided to surprise and take by night the supplies of the militia in Concord, 20 miles away. Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the patriots, heard of it, and secretly sent Paul Revere galloping out of Boston on a fast horse to awaken the people along the way and carry the alarm to Concord. When the British reached Lexington, about 9 miles from Boston, they found 70 or 80 citizens armed and waiting for them in the darkness. Early in the morning of the 19th of April, 1775, the first battle of the great American Revolution was fought, the Battle of Lexington. The trained soldiers of England soon scattered the handful of patriots at Lexington and Concord, but as the day wore on they were joined by other patriots, and by the night of April 20th, General Gage found himself besieged in Boston by a rustic army of 16,000 men. The news of the battle spread rapidly, and spurred the colonies to instant and bitter war. Washington said that the once happy America must be drenched in blood or inhabited by slaves, and that no true man could hesitate to choose death for himself rather than slavery for his country. He was at Mount Vernon when the sad news came, getting ready to attend the Second Congress. One winter day, while riding, Washington was caught in a heavy storm of rain and snow. He was used to all kinds of weather, and thought nothing of the exposure, even though he was hoarse and had a severe cold the next day. Before morning of the third day, he was very ill, and when the doctors came they bled him. It was the stupid practice of those days, and in a few hours Washington was so weakened as to be past hope of recovery. He died on December 14th, 1799, as bravely as he had lived. His wife, praying beside him, was as brave and as calm as he. He had asked that his funeral might be a simple one, and so it was. None was there but friends and neighbors. The casket was carried out upon the veranda that all might see his face. Troops from Alexandria, Virginia, with solemn music led the funeral procession. 4 clergymen in white followed. The General's favorite horse, with saddle and bridle, was led by 2 negro grooms. The casket, borne by Freemasons and army officers, was followed by his family, and by friends and neighbors. While minute guns were fired from a warship in the river below, the procession wound along the lovely paths of Mount Vernon to the family tomb on the hillside. Here the body was laid to rest with religious and Masonic ceremonies. When the news reached the people that Washington was dead, the whole country went into deepest mourning. In Europe the sorrow was true and sincere. The British fleets put their flags at half-mast, and Napoleon ordered crepe put upon the banners of France. Though Washington was born and educated in America, and belongs truly to Americans, he was such a friend to humanity, such a champion of liberty, that the whole world claims him as a model. His will provided that after the death of his wife all his slaves should be free, and he left money for those who could not earn a living. His able management had made Mount Vernon a great estate of 9,000 acres. Beside this, he held 44 other tracts of land in 9 different states, and he was one of the greatest landowners in America. Believing that the Republic would stand secure only upon a foundation of education, courage, and conscience, he left money for a great American university. In this he wanted the young people to be trained in the principles of true Americanism. He wanted the intelligence of the country to guide its politics. It is unfortunate that to the present day the university has not been founded, although there is now every likelihood that such a national university will be established in Washington, and vast sums contributed to the fund Washington had left for this purpose. The site of the city of Washington was selected for the federal capital in 1790, and 10 years later the seat of government was moved from Philadelphia to Washington. President Washington himself headed the body of commissioners who chose the site and arranged for the purchase of the land. The city was named in his honor. It is beautifully laid out with magnificent avenues, parks, fountains, and stately buildings, and is one of the finest and most comfortable cities in the world. In the house at Mount Vernon there was a little attic room, hot in summer, bitter cold in winter, but its one window was the only one that looked upon the tomb on the hillside, and so Mrs. Washington, after the death of her husband, moved into this little room. 2½ years later she died there, and her body was laid beside that of Washington. Years passed, and the beautiful house began to fall into ruin. A new and simple tomb was erected to Washington, but it also was neglected. Nothing was done to restore Mount Vernon until the women of the country bought the place. They rebuilt the walls and porches, brought back the old furniture, planted vines about the tomb, and still kept it, as Washington would have wished, as a shrine for all to visit, where respect can be paid to the memory of the father of his country.
Well, that's it for 1799. Let me know if you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for all the support this show has been receiving. We're about to begin covering the 1800s, and the next 100 episodes cover a time in American history I honestly didn't know much about before beginning researching this show, except, of course, the notable conflicts. I look forward to presenting the massive political changes and world-changing inventions of the 19th century year by year, month by month. 1799 ends on a sobering note. It's been a year of naval victories, constitutional tests, epidemic evacuations, diplomatic achievements, and domestic unrest, all eclipsed by the death of the man who has guided the nation since before our independence. The quasi-war edges towards conclusion. Tomorrow, the Revolution of 1800. But for now, this has been our story, 250 years of the United States of America, and as always, thanks for listening.